Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and welcome to my review of the debut album from DJ Wildstylez. This one is called Lose Control. I think the album's name is based off his newest record label, Lose Control, obviously the same name. Before we get into this, I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on hardstyle, and you might have heard it a little bit when I've talked on Sakura Burst's album Deconstructing Nature. Had a little bit of a hardstyle influence on one of the songs, and a lot of people enjoy it as this pure euphoric kind of energy and just kind of pumping dance music. And just the thing that I really don't like about it is actually shown off extremely well in this record. The fact that many of the hardstyle tracks use the same exact lead synth, use the same exact kick sample, and I don't know if it's slightly deferred or if everyone that produces hardstyle just happens to use the same things. It seems like most of the popular hardstyle producers use the same lead synths and the same kick, which is the bonk kick, and most of that is clearly shown in this record, and that's why I'm going to have a little bit of a loss for words for what to say in this album review, because honestly, most of it is basically just the same lead synth and the same kick, and honestly, basically this album sounds like the same track over and over again, and I could not for the life of me get through this record. And now I don't mean to say that this entire record is terrible, like that last record I reviewed. I'm not going to talk about it. I never want to talk about that record again. I want to forget I listened to that. But this record's not as bad as that one, but honestly, if you hear the same track over and over again, like this record is, and like most hardstyle is for me, if you can make something interesting out of it, if you can be like Pegboard Nerds with Hero, or you can be like my friend Greater Than. He's making a lot of waves, and he's been supported by Dioro recently. And he's a hardstyle producer and produces a lot of unique and interesting material. And drop-wise and with the lead synths, a lot of it sounds very different and goes at different tempos and just sounds pretty good and is fairly enjoyable just because of its uniqueness. But on this record, I think Wildstylez didn't exactly take a risky route with this and just kind of went with what he could make. And it's very fitting that the album was named after his own record label, because you'll be hearing a lot of music that sounds just like this within the hardstyle scene. You're going to hear lots of music that sounds basically just like it. And I started listening to Wildstylez a little bit after he released his Never Say Goodbye remix, and I think it was very wise of him to release a track with bright lights on this album called Every Step I Take, and it's very nice to hear her vocals on this in the light of an album which most tracks are instrumentals and hardstyle instrumentals, to say that, and it gets very boring to hear that. Hear a little bit of her vocals is very refreshing. We also hear the track Roots, which goes off kind of a classic Showtek kind of sound, but does bring a little bit more of a different sound than if Wildstylez had just directly copied Showtek's old sound, and that's partially why I enjoyed it. Classic hardstyle to me actually sounds pretty good, with tracks like the F track by Showtek and FTS. Those tracks are very good, and what hardstyle has kind of evolved into is just this kind of generic style, and that's kind of the same route I went with Big Room, where everything just kind of sounded the same, and that's what really pushed me away from it. Speaking of Big Room, there's the track Turn the Music Up, and I honestly feel like this was just pointing in the direction of something like Turn Up the Speakers by Martin Garrix and Afrojack. There's just lots of tracks that sound like this, and this is just supposed to be a Big Room hit, and I feel like this is something that Wildstylez felt like he could push to artists like W&W and Headhunters and people like that who play a mixture of Big Room and hard style sounds and hard dance styles. And honestly, that although that does change the style a little bit, change the tempo from where most of the album is going, it's just not enjoyable, and it's a pretty generic loud Big Room song, and really doesn't fit on an album like most of these hardstyle tracks do. My favorite track on the record is this kind of silly track called Play My Record, and I think that's kind of pointing to something like, hey DJ, play my record, just talking about radio stations and things like that. But the main thing that's enjoyable about this is its uniqueness that stands out from the rest of the record. It's got a little bit more of an electro sound, but also sped up, and it doesn't have that generic kick, it doesn't have all those generic synths, and honestly I feel like this could have been a step in the right direction. If Wildstylez could have built on this sound, or pushed out into a bunch of different sounds, then this record could have been very solid, especially with lead tracks like this. And although this track isn't going to get a bunch of attention like many of the tracks on this record will end up getting in the dance music scene, it is very enjoyable. And honestly, I might grab the track and maybe a couple others from this record because they are pretty good. And although, like I said, still not extremely enjoyable, I do like a couple of these tracks and they are worth a grab. So if you're going to get one track off this record, get Play My Record. My final rating for this album is a solid 2, and it's obviously not the worst rating I've given something, and it's not going to be the worst rating I ever give something. I think I've actually given a rating of every possible thing except for a 1.5 now, which is actually pretty crazy that I've given basically my standards for what I think each rating of an album is. And like I said, for the most part you're just getting pretty generic synths and the same kick over and over again, and that's the main thing that pushed me away. If it would have only been 1 or 2 tracks like this, my opinion on this album would have been a lot higher. And if you want to listen to something very diverse and unique as a musical album, don't listen to this. If you want an album full of lots of main stage hardstyle bangers that you could hear at DEF CON, get this record. And honestly, I feel like if a person is really crazy about that hardstyle sound, really crazy about that classic Wildstylez and Headhunters sound, and a little bit of that Showtek sound that they used to do back when they were doing hardstyle, you'll really like this album. But other than that, there's not much to take away from this. So anyway, what'd you guys think of this record? If you're a person like me, you should probably avoid this. Check out a couple of the interesting tracks that I listed. And hope you guys enjoyed this little review. See you guys later. Peace.